On a September night in the city of Nice, a woman wrapped herself in a long red silk scarf, stepped into an open car, and within moments the fabric entangled itself in the wheel, silencing forever the restless body that had once redefined the art of dance. Dearest listener, before we enter her life's fragile thread, I greet you across distance and time. Tell me, if you wish, in the comments where and when you are listening, so that these voices weave a circle of memory. And if you feel the wish for more journeys like this, I invite you to subscribe, for in doing so, you help keep the lantern of timeless stories burning. The evening of her death has long since dissolved into legend, but to reach its meaning, we must step backwards, as though retracing footprints in sand slowly erased by tide. Her story does not begin in the light of French boulevards, nor among marble halls of Europe, but on the rugged coast of California in San Francisco in the year 1877. The air there was sharp with salt, and the Pacific's roar filled the dreams of a child named Isadora Duncan. Her family had little but hunger and the fragile hope her mother carried after her father's ruin. It is said that her father, a banker, fell into scandal and disgrace, leaving behind both debts and shadows. The mother, Mary Dora, raised her children alone, teaching them music and poetry by lamplight, insisting that even in hardship the soul must be nourished by beauty. In such soil grew the seed of Isadora's art. Barefoot upon the shore, she moved with the rhythm of the waves, her arms answering to the wind, her steps guided by the pull of tide. She never believed dance should be caged in rigid shoes or measured in counts imposed by others. To her, dance was the body remembering its kinship with nature. One might wonder, did she discover dance, or did dance discover her? The boundary is unclear, as though she were born already carrying this truth within her bones. The house she lived in was not large, but within it music rang often. A violin, a piano, the trembling voices of children learning together. She was the youngest daughter, restless, impatient with lessons, yearning instead for freedom. When other girls were taught obedience, she gazed toward horizons, seeking a life yet unseen. Some say she was difficult, some say she was radiant. Both are true, for such souls rarely fit easily into the world. Her mother encouraged all 4 children to shape their own paths. Dora Duncan believed art was not luxury but survival, a sacred necessity in a world too often careless with human hearts. From her mother, Isadora absorbed not only resilience, but rebellion, the refusal to accept life's boundaries as final. How much of her later fire came from this maternal teaching, spoken softly in the dark when the oil lamp flickered and the sea winds rattled thin window panes. When she was only a child, Isadora began teaching younger ones to dance, not in the polished studios of academies, but in open rooms, barefoot, using scarves and flowing gestures. She believed even children could understand the secret pulse of movement, if only freed from rules. It was here that she first became a teacher, and here that her philosophy of dance began to take shape, long before critics would give it names. She called it simply freedom. The Pacific coast shaped her. The sound of the tide became a rhythm she carried for life. One can almost hear it in her movements later upon European stages, the swelling and the release, the forward surge and the quiet return. The ocean was her earliest orchestra, her first partner, and in a way, her most faithful companion. Yet behind the vision lay poverty. The family lived modestly, often relying on neighbors' kindness. Isadora, too proud to despair, insisted on making her body and spirit a vessel of abundance. She danced not to please, but to survive the weight of want. Perhaps this is why her art always bore a trace of defiance. To dance was to insist upon life, even when life offered little. As she grew, San Francisco's hills became too small for her restless imagination. She looked outward as though the world itself was a stage waiting for her presence. Already she dreamed of leaving, of carrying her barefoot dances across seas. Did the Pacific whisper to her that she would one day return, not as a child, but as a legend? The tide carried her forward, though she could not yet see where it led. In the city, ballet and structured dances were celebrated, but she found them lifeless, bound in constraint. She observed girls in stiff costumes, their feet aching within satin shoes, and she wondered why beauty must be tied to suffering. She rejected these forms, refusing to compress her body into postures alien to its natural flow. Instead, she looked to the ancient world, to myths of Greece and Rome, to vases where figures moved with grace and simplicity. This vision would take years to ripen, but the seed was there, in a girl watching waves, imagining eternity in the curve of water. The poverty of her youth never truly left her. In later years, even at the height of fame, she lived extravagantly when fortune smiled, yet knew the bitterness of debts when fortune turned. But as a child, she endured it with the resilience of imagination. She dreamed, and through dreaming, she survived. Each step she took on the wooden floors of her childhood home was already a step toward a stage far beyond San Francisco. Her mother sometimes told her children that their destiny was not to be ordinary. The family was poor, but destined for something greater, though what that might be was hidden. Perhaps Mary Dora believed it, or perhaps she spoke it only to keep despair away from her children's faces. Yet Isadora carried this prophecy as though it were carved into her. She was not to live a quiet life. She was to move the world. Thus the first chapter of her journey closes with an image. The young Isadora, barefoot on the shore, her hair lifted by sea winds, her arms outstretched, her body flowing not with steps counted by teachers, but with the endless rhythm of the Pacific tide. The waves rise, they fall, they vanish, yet they return again, as though to remind us that beginnings are always tied to endings. And so, too, her story moves, from the hush of ocean to the silence that awaited her at the end, already foreshadowed in the turning of the sea. The tide swells once more, then recedes, leaving the sand damp and glistening under fading light. And in that soft silence we step onward, into the next part of her path. The tide recedes, leaving behind a faint sheen upon the sand, and in that dim reflection we glimpse the outlines of her family's trials. The Duncan household was never far from hardship. Her father, Joseph Charles Duncan, had once been a man of means, a banker, a figure of respectability. Yet his life collapsed under accusations of fraud, and with that collapse came disgrace. The family name, once secure, was spoken with pity, sometimes with scorn. Isadora was too young to remember all the details, but she grew beneath the shadow of this fall, her childhood marked not by stability, but by struggle. Her mother, Mary Dora, was left to gather the fragments of a broken life and to raise her 4 children alone. The small rooms where they lived held no luxuries, only necessities, and often not enough of those. There was always the question of food, of rent, of what the next day might bring. Yet out of these narrow conditions rose something luminous, for Dora insisted that her children be fed not only with bread but with music, literature, and art. When she played the piano, her hands trembling with both fatigue and resolve, she filled the room with sounds that rose above hunger. She read to them poetry and stories of ancient heroes, letting imagination serve as nourishment. In those moments, the children might forget the cold, the debts, the uncertainty, and believe instead in a higher calling. Isadora, quick in spirit, absorbed her mother's lessons not as mere words, but as guiding truths. If life could turn from wealth to poverty in an instant, then the only security lay in inner freedom. Perhaps this belief took root the day she saw her mother light a single candle against the fog of San Francisco, refusing darkness its victory. the flicker of that flame would accompany her throughout her life, a reminder that defiance itself can be a kind of beauty. The siblings formed a small republic of art. Isadora, along with her sister Elizabeth and her brothers Raymond and Augustin, created performances for neighbors, teaching each other steps, playing small pieces of music, improvising dramas. There was no stage but the worn wooden floors, no audience but a handful of curious onlookers. Yet in their minds, the living room transformed into a temple, and the movements of their young bodies into rituals of expression. For Isadora, there was already the conviction that dance was not frivolity, but necessity, a way of speaking when words faltered. She began giving lessons to younger children in the neighborhood, teaching them to move freely. She charged only small sums, but in those classes she discovered her gift not only as a dancer, but as a teacher, a guide for others to uncover the rhythms within themselves. She had no formal training in ballet, nor did she wish for it. She believed that each body carried its own language, and her task was to help it speak. The poverty of her surroundings did not deter her, but gave urgency to her vision. If beauty could be born in such conditions, then surely it was meant for all, not just the wealthy or the disciplined. Yet the world around her offered little recognition. San Francisco was still a young city, restless, filled with commerce and ambition, but not yet fertile ground for radical visions of art. When she walked its streets barefoot, as she sometimes did, people turned to stare, muttering that she was strange, perhaps improper. From childhood, she bore the weight of being misunderstood, a weight that would never truly leave her. But she also bore pride in that difference, the pride of one who knows she belongs not to the present, but to something larger, still unseen. Her brothers and sisters shared this hunger for art. Elizabeth would later open schools of dance. Raymond would become her companion in artistic ventures. Augustin would lend his talents in various ways. Together, they were bound by loyalty, yet also by the fire of individual visions. The Duncan family was both fragile and indestructible, living always on the edge of collapse, yet sustained by an unshakable sense of destiny. Was this faith born from necessity, or was it a genuine glimpse of something extraordinary to come? Perhaps it was both, for in hardship one must either despair or dream. They chose to dream. Isadora's early years were marked not by stages and applause, but by this fragile weaving of survival and imagination. She knew hunger, but she also knew the intoxication of freedom when she moved without constraint. She was mocked for her independence, but she was also quietly admired by those who saw in her a flame they could not name. She had no formal schooling after a certain point, rejecting institutions, declaring herself her own teacher. Knowledge, she believed, could be taken from life itself, from observation, from listening to the world's rhythm. Was she reckless in this? Or was she simply unwilling to bend? In later years, she would say that schools destroyed the natural instincts of children, binding them too tightly, and she had carried that belief since youth. In the evenings, when fog crept inland from the Pacific, she would sometimes stand by the window watching the lights of ships moving slowly into the harbor. Each lantern swaying at sea seemed like a beacon of possibility, promising another life beyond the confines of her small room. Perhaps in those moments she promised herself that one day she would follow those ships, leaving behind both poverty and misunderstanding. The city around her offered little, but the world beyond whispered of greater stages, audiences who might recognize what her neighbors could not. Thus her childhood was a paradox. Outwardly, it was a life of want and humiliation, the shadow of her father's disgrace and the ceaseless struggle of her mother. Inwardly, it was a life of immense richness, filled with imagination, beauty, and a sense of destiny. Isadora grew between these two worlds, balancing on the line between despair and vision. Her art was born of this tension, the refusal to be defined by hardship, the insistence on creating beauty even when the world seemed barren. The candle that her mother once lit in the fog remained in her memory, a fragile flame against vast darkness. That image of light refusing to yield closes this chapter of her life. For even as the Duncan children faced ridicule and want, that small flame guided them, a promise that they would not vanish into obscurity. The fog thickens, the candle burns, and the young Isadora, restless and radiant, begins to dream of a world beyond San Francisco's narrow streets. The candle's flame trembles in the breath of fog, its light wavering yet unextinguished, and in that fragile glow she steps forward, restless, ready to carry her dream eastward where the unknown waits. The candle's flame flickers in the breath of fog, trembling yet steady, and when it fades from sight, we hear instead the distant rumble of train wheels, iron carrying ambition across the continent. It was upon such wheels that Isadora's path shifted, for the yearning that had filled her nights in San Francisco could not be contained by the narrow streets nor by the ebb and flow of the Pacific tide. She was still only a girl, scarcely out of childhood, but already restless with the sense that her destiny lay elsewhere. And so she turned eastward toward Chicago and later New York, the places where she believed the future might open before her. The journey itself was an education. Through the windows of the train, she watched landscapes unroll like pages of a great book. Valleys, plains, mountains dissolving into cities, each view reminding her that the world was vaster than her childhood had allowed. In the rhythm of wheels on tracks, she heard again the beat of her own steps, a cadence that told her she was moving towards something unknown yet necessary. There was excitement but also loneliness, for she traveled not with family but with her own determination, carrying little more than hope and the conviction that art must be pursued even in poverty. Chicago in those days was a city of vigor and noise, rebuilt after fire, alive with commerce and opportunity. Yet for a barefoot girl who spoke of dance as communion with nature, it was also harsh, impatient with visions that did not fit into theaters of profit. Isadora offered lessons, danced where she could, spoke of freedom of movement, but the city did not easily listen. It was a place of industry, and art that did not entertain seemed to many a useless luxury. Still, she persisted, gathering a few children, showing them how to sway like reeds in wind, how to move not by command but by instinct. She earned little, but she practiced conviction. When Chicago yielded few possibilities, she turned her eyes further east, to New York, where theaters gleamed with promise and stages were said to welcome all forms. New York, however, was a paradox. It promised openness, but in its crowded halls and glittering lights, she found the same rigidity she had resisted in San Francisco. Ballet dominated, with its rigid postures and stiff conventions. Audiences flocked to spectacles, to grand shows filled with ornament, not to a young woman dancing barefoot, her tunic flowing, her gestures simple yet profound. They laughed sometimes, called her strange, unrefined. She was offered minor parts in companies, but the roles were empty to her. Demanding steps, she felt, betrayed the soul of movement. She refused them, and by refusing, she placed herself on the edges, admired by few, dismissed by many. Yet it was in New York that her belief hardened into certainty. She realized she could not compromise, that her art would never find its place in a world that demanded conformity. She spoke to those who would listen of dance as a language older than words, of rhythm as the very pulse of life. She said the body should move as trees move, as waves rise and fall, as clouds drift. Some mocked her, others were quietly intrigued, and in these small circles of sympathy she found encouragement enough to continue. Her siblings remained companions in spirit, though they pursued their own paths, Letters passed between them, carrying both comfort and resolve. Elizabeth encouraged her. Raymond dreamed with her. Augustin offered what little he could. The Duncan family, though scattered, remained bound by a belief that their lives were meant to carry art forward, against odds, against poverty, against ridicule. At times in New York, she walked through Central Park, barefoot even on winter's edge, drawing stares from passers-by. To her, shoes felt like chains, binding the body away from the earth's direct embrace. She said later that to dance barefoot was not rebellion but necessity, the only way to feel the truth of soil beneath flesh. Was it madness, or was it the clarity of one who refused illusions? She herself never doubted. The city did not welcome her, but it did not break her. Instead, it sharpened her resolve, showing her what she must leave behind. She saw that America, restless and young, still craved spectacle more than sincerity. If her art was to breathe, it would need soil more ancient, where history itself could echo through her movements. Europe began to gleam in her imagination, distant yet inevitable. She read of Paris, of London, of Athens, places where art was not merely amusement but identity. And so, the whisper that had haunted her nights in San Francisco returned. You must leave. You must cross the ocean. Before she could set sail, she continued to teach, to scrape a living from small lessons. She found children more open than adults, their bodies still unbound by rigidity, their spirits still willing to imagine. In guiding them, she honed her philosophy, believing more firmly than ever that education must begin with freedom, not constraint. She spoke against schools, against rules that stifled creativity, calling them prisons of the young. Her words earned her little money, but defined her vision. In them, we already hear the voice of the woman who would one day open schools of dance in Europe, places she dreamed would restore the natural movements of humanity. At night, in her small New York room, she lit candles much like her mother had done in San Francisco. The flame bent and swayed, and she studied it as though it were a teacher. Movement, she thought, must be like flame, unpredictable, alive, unable to be forced into shape, yet always true to its essence. Perhaps the candle carried her back to her mother's lessons, or perhaps it reminded her that even in darkness, a small light could create its own world. She danced for herself when no one watched, creating gestures inspired by the ocean she had left behind. The sound of the tide still echoed in her memory, and she tried to find it again in the silence of her room. Bare feet pressing against wooden floors, arms rising and falling like waves, she rehearsed not steps but emotions, the kind that could not be scripted. She was poor, often hungry, but in those solitary dances she felt rich, as though the whole of existence moved through her. The city outside roared with commerce, carriages rattling, voices shouting, factories pounding, but within her she heard another rhythm, older, quieter, insistent. This rhythm told her she could not remain in America. It told her that to find her true stage, she must cross waters wider even than the Pacific, waters that divided continents, waters that could either drown her or carry her to destiny. Thus this chapter ends with the sound of train wheels fading into the distance, replaced by the cry of gulls circling over a great harbor. The candle she watched in her New York room seems to merge with the lanterns of ships waiting at dock, each promising departure. The girl who had once gazed at ships in San Francisco, imagining other lives, now stands ready to step aboard. She does not yet know the trials that await in Europe, the salons that will whisper her name, the scandals that will follow, nor the tragedies that will break her heart. She knows only that she must leave, that the stage she seeks lies across the sea. The gulls cry, the tide shifts, and the gangway lowers. She steps forward carrying nothing but her conviction and the restless rhythm of her own body. The gulls wheel and cry above the harbor, their voices fading as the gangway is pulled back, and with them recedes the last tether to her old life. The ship groans as it sets out upon the Atlantic, the waters rolling vast and unbroken before her. For days, the horizon is a line without end, the sea restless beneath an ever-changing sky. To some, such a voyage is monotony, but to Isadora, it is liberation. She stands often on deck, her scarf whipping in the salt wind, her hair loose, her feet shifting instinctively with the rhythm of the ship's sway. The Atlantic is not gentle, but she does not resist its movement. She lets it enter her, as though this endless water is teaching her a new cadence, one she will carry when she steps upon the soil of Europe. When London's gray skyline finally appears, it is not the marble city of her imagination, but a fog-laden expanse, dense with chimneys, soot, and the ceaseless noise of horse-drawn carriages. It is 1899, and the city is heavy with industry, its people moving in ordered streams, its theaters gleaming with ornate facades that hide within them an art still bound to strict forms. For a barefoot dancer newly arrived from America, there is no clear welcome, no open door. Yet she believes this is the place from which her destiny must begin. She seeks work wherever she can find it, but the grand theaters laugh at the idea of a woman dancing barefoot in flowing tunics. They want precision ballets, operettas, light entertainments. They want what the audiences already understand, not the wild gestures of a stranger who speaks of freedom and antiquity. Isadora endures rejection after rejection, yet she does not despair. Instead, she turns to smaller venues, music halls, drawing rooms, salons of the curious and the wealthy. It is in these intimate spaces under chandeliers and among velvet drapes that she first begins to make her impression. At gatherings of artists and aristocrats, she steps forward not in satin slippers, but barefoot, her simple tunic draping loosely, her movements flowing with a sincerity that unsettles as much as it enchants. Some whisper that she is indecent, others that she is divine. She speaks afterwards of the Greeks, of the simplicity of nature, of movement as prayer. To some she sounds foolish, to others prophetic. Yet always there is fascination, for no one has seen a woman move in this way before. London society is divided. The music halls are filled with laughter and ridicule when she appears, the audiences expecting spectacle and finding instead gestures they cannot interpret. But in the private salons of intellectuals, poets, and sculptors, she is received with curiosity. These rooms become her first stage, not large, but filled with voices that matter. Here she meets patrons who see beyond convention, who whisper her name to friends, who invite her again and again. It is not fame, but it is a beginning. She lives modestly, as always, often in rented rooms barely warmed by thin coal fires. The damp of London seeps into her bones, but she cares little for comfort. What she longs for is recognition, not of herself, but of her vision. She is convinced that her art carries a truth, ancient and necessary, and she speaks of it to anyone who will listen. She says that dance must return to its origins, that the body must once more become the instrument of the soul. She gestures to the friezes of the Parthenon, to vases adorned with figures in flowing lines, and insists that in those images lies the secret she wishes to restore. At times she walks along the Thames, the fog rising from its dark waters, the gas lamps flickering in the mist. The city hums with commerce, but she hears instead the echo of ancient songs. She imagines the river as another sea, carrying her toward a destiny still just out of reach. She's alone in many ways, a stranger in a vast city, yet she carries within her a certainty that she belongs not to the present moment, but to something older, something enduring. Her reputation begins to grow slowly. Word spreads of the American girl who dances like no other, whose bare feet and flowing garments defy the rigid lines of ballet. Some critics dismiss her as eccentric, others call her a genius. For her, the opinions matter less than the freedom to continue. She accepts invitations to perform in parlors and galleries, sometimes for small coins, sometimes only for the meal and warmth offered afterwards. She gives herself fully in each performance, as though the future depends upon every gesture. Perhaps in a way it does. In these years, she refines her philosophy. She writes notes, keeps journals, sketches ideas of movement, often by candlelight in her cold room. She insists that dance must not be bound by mechanical steps, but must flow from the solar plexus, the center of life, radiating outward through limbs as naturally as breath. She believes dance is not entertainment, but revelation, the body speaking what the soul cannot put into words. Such ideas place her outside the mainstream, but they also mark her as visionary. Still, poverty dogs her. She borrows, she improvises, she endures hunger. Her clothes are simple, often self-fashioned, her possessions few. Yet she moves through salons as though draped in majesty, her presence carrying more weight than silk or jewels could provide. She shocks, she intrigues, she unsettles, and slowly the ripples of her presence spread further. But London, for all its salons and stages, is only the threshold. She senses it herself, that while the city has given her a beginning, it cannot yet offer her the stage she needs. She dreams of Paris, of its vibrant bohemian world, of its openness to the avant-garde. Already the name of Loie Fuller, the American dancer who triumphed there with her luminous veils and swirling lights, reaches Isadora's ears. She imagines herself not in the shadow of Fuller, but as part of a lineage of renewal. To Paris, then, she will go. This chapter closes not with applause nor with triumph, but with a quiet image. Isadora, standing at a window in a modest London room, the fog pressing against the glass, the faint glow of gas lamps blurring in the distance. Behind her lies America, with its rejection and its limits. Around her lies London, curious yet unyielding. Ahead of her lies Paris, where destiny waits. The fog curls like a curtain, and she stands poised to step through it, as though onto a new stage, barefoot and unafraid. The fog thickens, muffling the city's noises, until only the sound of her breath remains. And from within that silence, the promise of Paris begins to glow faintly, like a lamp seen through mist, calling her onward. The fog of London thickens, curling against the glass, and through it glimmers a faint glow, as though a lamp burns far away on the other side. That glow, when the mist clears, is Paris, the city that for centuries had drawn dreamers and wanderers, the city where art walked freely in cafes and on boulevards, where poets argued into the night, and where even scandal could become a form of immortality. For Isadora, Paris was not a destination chosen by chance. It was a summons, a call she had felt even as she stood barefoot by the Pacific, a city she believed would understand her restless dance. And so she left the damp streets of London behind and crossed the Channel, the waters carrying her not merely to another city, but to a new beginning. Paris greeted her with a vitality different from London's stern grandeur. The air itself seemed lighter, more willing to bend toward delight, and the streets carried an undercurrent of play. Carriages rattled past the Champs-Élysées, cafes overflowed with voices, and music lingered in the air as though born from the stones. Yet beneath the lightness was also scrutiny. For Paris, though open to novelty, was not gentle with the unproven. To find her place here, Isadora would need not only vision, but courage. At first, the pattern repeated itself. She found little welcome on the grand stages, where opera and ballet reigned supreme. The directors and impresarios dismissed her with polite smiles or sharp refusals, declaring that audiences would never accept a barefoot woman in loose tunics when they had grown accustomed to tutus and precise formations. But Isadora did not despair, for she knew her path lay not in repetition of the old but in persistence of the new. And once again, as in London, she found doors opening in smaller spaces, salons of artists, studios of painters, gatherings where the avant-garde sought to challenge tradition. It was in such circles that she encountered Loie Fuller, the American-born dancer whose veils and colored lights had already enchanted Paris. Fuller, with her luminous wings of fabric, was unlike anyone else, and her success gave proof that Paris could embrace radical visions. Between the two women there was recognition, though their styles were different. Fuller's was of spectacle and transformation, Isadora's of simplicity and truth. Yet both sought liberation from convention. Fuller became not only a supporter, but a bridge, introducing Isadora to circles of artists, sculptors, and poets who saw in her the embodiment of a new possibility. She danced in drawing rooms where marble statues looked on silently, her movements echoing the poses carved by ancient hands. She spoke of Greece, of vases whose painted figures seemed to leap into life when she moved. She wrapped herself in tunics reminiscent of antiquity, refusing the corsets and decorations of her time. Her body became her declaration, natural, unbound, radiant. Audiences whispered. Some were shocked, others transfixed, but none remained indifferent. She was not yet famous, but she was unforgettable. The critics, too, began to take notice. A few wrote of her as a curiosity, a strange American attempting to revive ancient Greece. But others saw more, a renewal of art itself, a gesture that seemed to reconnect the modern world to something eternal. They described her movements as flowing like water, as though her body followed laws of nature rather than choreography. She was compared to muses, to nymphs, to goddesses. For Isadora, such comparisons were flattering but secondary. What mattered was that her vision was beginning to find echo. Her philosophy deepened in Paris. Surrounded by paintings, sculptures, and the hum of intellectual debate, she refined her belief that dance must arise from the center of the body, the solar plexus, the wellspring of life. From there, movement must radiate outward, just as breath fills the body, just as waves ripple from a stone dropped into water. She wrote of it, she spoke of it, she lived it in every performance, and though many still doubted her, enough believed to sustain her. In her modest lodgings, she dreamed of schools where children would learn to move freely, where education would be liberation rather than discipline. She longed for wide halls filled with sunlight, with children dancing barefoot on wooden floors, their laughter mingling with the rhythm of their steps. She imagined such schools not only in Paris, but across the world, believing her vision could restore humanity to harmony with nature. Dreams, as always, were her sustenance when reality offered little. Paris also introduced her to love, though in forms both fleeting and complex. Among the artists who admired her were men who saw in her not only a dancer, but a muse. Some she welcomed, others she rejected, but always she remained independent, refusing to bind herself in marriage. To her, love was part of life's movement, necessary yet never to become a chain. In this, as in art, she defied the conventions of her time, and Paris, with its tolerance for scandal, accepted her boldness more easily than other places might have. Yet despite the growing fascination, she still lived precariously. Money was scarce, patrons were unreliable, and her future uncertain. But in the glow of Parisian evenings, with lamplight shining on cobblestones and voices echoing from cafes, she felt she had found the soil where her art could grow roots. The salons became her stages, the artists her allies, the city itself her muse. One can imagine her walking along the Seine at twilight, the water reflecting lamps like trembling stars, her steps echoing lightly on the stone paths. The river reminded her of the Pacific and the Atlantic, of journeys past, yet here it flowed calmly through a city alive with history. She must have wondered if she had finally found a place where her vision could breathe, or if it was only another threshold leading to yet another horizon. Her life was always poised between arrival and departure, between recognition and rejection. Perhaps that was the very rhythm of her destiny. As her reputation spread, she began to attract not only curiosity but genuine acclaim. Sculptors sketched her. Painters sought to capture her movements in stillness. Poets wrote verses inspired by her presence. She had become more than a dancer. She was a symbol, a figure through which others projected their own ideals of freedom, beauty, and rebellion. Yet even as she became a symbol, she remained herself, restless, searching, never fully satisfied. This chapter does not end in triumph, but in suspension, as though she stands at a threshold. In a salon lit by oil lamps, she finishes a dance, her tunic clinging to her body, her breath visible in the dim glow. The applause is hesitant at first, then stronger, but she hears in it not finality, but the beginning of something larger. She bows, she smiles faintly, and within her heart already stirs the next dream, the next stage, the next journey. The sound of applause fades into the low hum of voices under chandeliers, and from that hum arises a question. Where will these steps carry her next? It is not London's fog that surrounds her now, but the golden glow of Parisian nights, and through that glow, another city begins to shimmer, another stage calling her onward. The hum of voices beneath chandeliers lingers, as though it might never fade. Yet beyond it, another sound rises, the low murmur of admiration that grows when art begins to touch something deeper than fashion. From the glow of Parisian salons, Isadora stepped into a larger current, drawn into circles where sculpture and painting, music and poetry intertwined. Here she found not only audiences, but companions, men and women, whose works were themselves rebellions against the rigidities of their age. Among them was Auguste Rodin, whose sculptures breathed life into stone, whose figures seemed to twist and bend with the same raw freedom Isadora sought in movement. He saw in her not simply a dancer, but a living embodiment of the vitality he carved. She, in turn, recognized in his work the proof that art could reveal the body not as ornament, but as truth. In these encounters, her philosophy ripened. She no longer spoke merely of freedom in movement, but of a return to origins, to the purity of Greek antiquity. The vases she studied in museums, adorned with figures and flowing postures, seemed to her not relics but instructions. Their stillness carried within it the memory of dances once performed under open sky, long before ballet's corsets and numbered steps. She sought to bring those images to life, to let her body speak what the ancients had once inscribed. When she danced, it was not imitation but invocation, as though the line from past to present could be drawn through her own limbs. She adopted the tunic, loose and unbound, its folds echoing those of classical statuary. Barefoot, she moved with simplicity, her gestures rising not from artifice, but from a center she called the solar plexus. To her, all true movement radiated from that point, as naturally as breath. Arms lifted not because a choreographer commanded it, but because the soul, through breath, demanded it. Each performance was less a sequence of steps than a meditation, a living poem traced through space. Some called it eccentric, others divine. For Isadora, it was neither. It was necessity, the only way her body knew to speak. Paris responded with fascination. The avant-garde embraced her, finding in her dances a visual language that harmonized with their own pursuits of freedom. Sculptors sought to sketch her mid-movement. Painters tried to capture the ephemeral curve of her arms. Poets likened her to muses stepping out of myth. She became more than a performer. She became a symbol, a reminder that art could still break free from constraint and return to origins older than modern memory. Yet the city's embrace was never without contradiction. There were critics who accused her of affectation, who dismissed her simplicity as a mask for lack of technique. They demanded the precision of ballet, the virtuosity of tradition, and could not see in her flowing gestures the deeper virtuosity of truth. Isadora listened, but she did not bend. Her path had never been one of compromise. She continued to dance in salons, in studios, sometimes even in open gardens where the wind itself seemed to partner her. The applause of the sympathetic, the silence of skeptics, both mattered less than the conviction that she was answering a call older than herself. Her vision expanded into dreams of schools. She imagined large halls filled with light, with children dancing freely, their movements not bound to mimicry, but born from their own instincts. She spoke of it often, and though the dream was not yet realized, she carried it like a seed within her. In her journals, she wrote of dance as the mother of all arts, as the root from which poetry, music, and painting had once grown. To restore dance to its primal purity, she believed, was to restore art itself. Her personal life, even in these early Paris years, bore the mark of her defiance. She moved through love affairs with the same independence that marked her dancing. Men were drawn to her beauty, to her intensity, but she never allowed herself to be bound. Marriage seemed to her another form of corset, another way of binding the body and spirit. She preferred love as experience, as inspiration, but never as chain. The Parisian press, eager for scandal, whispered of her lovers, but she neither denied nor confessed. She lived openly, her life an extension of her art, unashamed of desires that society preferred hidden. In the evenings when she walked along the Seine, she saw the lamps shimmering on water, their reflections bending with the current. The river seemed to echo her own philosophy, movement that was not forced, but natural, flowing from its source without end. She carried the sound of the Pacific still within her, but now it mingled with the rhythm of this European river, shaping a language that belonged to no single shore. She was becoming not merely an American or a Parisian, but something larger, a woman of the world, whose body carried within it the memory of oceans, statues, and myths. Her performances began to draw larger audiences, no longer confined to salons but reaching into more public spaces. Though still unconventional, she had become a figure Paris could not ignore. The critics continued to divide, but the city itself seemed to lean toward her, intrigued by the audacity of a woman who dared to strip dance of ornament and reveal it as essence. She was called the priestess of free dance, though she herself resisted such titles. To her, she was simply answering the necessity that lived in her. Still, she remained precarious. Success in Paris was not wealth, and she continued to live with little, relying on patrons and friends. But she carried herself with dignity, as though she were draped not in poverty, but in destiny. Those who met her often remarked on her presence, a radiance that seemed to glow even in the simplest of surroundings. She was, in her own way, already a myth in the making. This chapter closes with an image of her dancing in a dimly lit gallery, the statues of Rodin surrounding her, their stone forms bending in gestures of struggle and ecstasy. Her body moves among them not as imitation, but as companion. Flesh echoing stone, stone echoing flesh. The audience watches in hushed silence, uncertain whether they are witnessing a performance or a ritual. And as her arms extend, her feet glide, her breath flows. The boundary between past and present dissolves. She becomes for a moment not merely Isadora Duncan, but a vessel through which the ancients speak again. The silence that follows is heavy, charged, unbroken, and in that silence, a new horizon stirs, for Paris has given her recognition, but beyond Paris lies yet another embrace, another city waiting, another destiny unfolding. The silence that followed her dance among the stone figures seemed heavy with secrets, and when it lifted, whispers began to thread through Paris, whispers not only of her art, but of her life beyond the stage. For in Isadora's world, the boundary between art and living was fragile, and the passions that animated her performances did not cease when the music ended. As her fame grew, so too did the attention upon her private hours, and soon the city was speaking as much of her loves as of her dances. To some, she was a goddess descended from marble, untouchable, a vision draped in tunic and barefoot grace. To others, she was a woman of flesh and desire, open in ways that scandalized the respectable. She herself never sought to separate the two. Love, like dance, was to her a necessity, a force as natural as breath. She did not believe in marriage, in vows that confined. She believed in encounters, in connections that flared like sudden fires, brief or enduring, always sincere in their moment. In this, too, she defied her age, which demanded discretion and permanence. Isadora offered neither. There were artists who courted her, poets who wrote verses in her honor, musicians who swore they found new melodies in the sway of her body. Some she welcomed, others she dismissed with a laugh or a silence. She could be tender, she could be cruel, but always she remained free. Among those who drew near were aristocrats intrigued by her wildness, intellectuals who admired her independence, and men of power who found in her a challenge unlike any they had known. Each love affair became a chapter in the legend already forming around her. Paris, tolerant of scandal, was fascinated. The newspapers hinted, the salons speculated, and while some condemned her, others admired the audacity of a woman who lived as though the rules of society were smoke. For Isadora, these affairs were not distractions from her art, but companions to it. Love, in all its tumult, fed her dance. Heartbreak, desire, ecstasy, and loss became movements of the body, gestures of the soul. She danced them into being, transforming personal passion into universal expression. One such love, with a sculptor whose hands shaped marble as hers shaped air, burned brightly, then dissolved into ash. Another, with a wealthy patron, promised security, but withered under her refusal to be owned. She seemed to move through men as she moved through music, never lingering where her freedom was threatened. Some called her reckless, others selfish, but perhaps she was simply unwilling to live half a life. She demanded of love the same as of art, truth, intensity, and freedom. Anything less she cast aside. Her affairs also inspired criticism that sought to diminish her art by tarnishing her character. Critics wrote that her dances were nothing but veiled expressions of sensuality, that her bare feet and flowing tunics concealed indecency. But such judgments only revealed society's discomfort with a woman who refused to separate body from spirit. For Isadora, dance was not sensuality alone, nor was it asceticism. It was wholeness, the body alive in its full truth. She carried her loves openly because to hide them would be a lie, and lies were what she despised most. Yet freedom is not without cost. With each affair came not only joy but sorrow, not only passion but conflict. Lovers quarreled, jealousy flared, and she, restless, often withdrew as suddenly as she had offered herself. These partings left wounds, on her, on others. She carried them into her performances, where audiences sometimes saw not only ecstasy but anguish traced in her movements. They felt her loves even if they did not know their names. It was in this period that she began to speak more openly of woman's freedom, declaring that the female body must no longer be a vessel of shame but of expression. She said that dance, in revealing the natural body, could liberate women from the chains of modesty and obedience. Such words shocked even sympathetic audiences, but they also drew followers, especially among younger women who longed for a new path. To them, Isadora was not merely a dancer, but a herald of change, embodying a life lived beyond convention. Still, the weight of gossip followed her. Friends defended her, enemies condemned her, but she herself walked through it with a mixture of pride and indifference. She seemed to understand that scandal was inseparable from her destiny, that to live so openly was to invite judgment. Rather than hide, she embraced it, her very refusal to be shamed becoming another form of defiance. In the quiet hours when the salons were empty and the applause faded, she sometimes sat alone by her window, the lamplight dim against the Paris night. Did she ever doubt herself then? Did she ever long for the security of ordinary life? If she did, she gave no sign. To those who knew her, she seemed made of certainty, a woman who carried her freedom as though it were both armor and burden. Yet perhaps within her there was a loneliness, the kind known only to those who refuse compromise. Her art in these years deepened, even as her personal life grew more entangled. She began to choreograph dances that told not only of joy but of sorrow, not only of desire but of despair. Her body became a mirror of life's contradictions, and audiences, whether they approved of her private choices or not, could not deny the truth they felt in her movements. She was not acting, she was living, and in that authenticity lay her power. This chapter closes with an image not of stage or gallery, but of a quiet salon after the guests have gone. The chandeliers are dim, the chairs askew, the scent of wine lingering in the air. Isadora stands alone in the center, barefoot upon the carpet, her scarf falling loosely from her shoulders. She has danced that evening not for applause, but for herself, each gesture an echo of passions known and passions lost. The silence now presses around her, heavy yet intimate, as though the city itself holds its breath. From that silence comes the faint memory of a kiss, the warmth of a touch, the ache of parting. These linger like unseen threads, binding her to her own destiny, and as the last candle sputters, leaving the room in shadows, the sound of the Seine carries faintly through the night, promising that love, like water, will return again and again, even as it slips away. The last candle sputters and fades, leaving the salon in shadows, and in that darkness another silence begins to gather, a silence not of solitude but of sorrow. For if love and scandal had marked Isadora's early Paris years, it was tragedy that would etch itself most deeply into her being, reshaping not only her art but her very breath. The Seine, which had so often seemed to her a gentle companion, reflecting lamps like trembling stars, would one day take from her what no stage could restore. She had become a mother, though she had never sought the sanctity of marriage. To her, love needed no priest, and children needed no legitimacy beyond the truth of their birth. She bore her first daughter, Deirdre, in 1906, fathered by stage designer Gordon Craig, a man as brilliant as he was unreliable. Later came her son Patrick, with Paris Singer, heir to the vast Singer-sewing machine fortune. To society, these unions without marriage were scandalous, but to Isadora they were simply honest. She claimed her children with pride, not as shameful secrets, but as extensions of her own freedom. Motherhood softened her, yet it also deepened her. She adored her children with a devotion as fierce as her art, often carrying them with her from place to place, refusing to confine them to one home while she traveled. She dreamed of raising them within her schools of dance, teaching them to move with the same freedom she sought for all children. To friends, she spoke tenderly of them, her voice glowing with pride. In their laughter, she found a music more profound than any orchestra. In their small steps, she saw the promise of a world renewed. But fate, ever merciless, intervened. On a cold day in 1913, tragedy struck. A chauffeur attempting to start a stalled car left it in gear. The vehicle lurched forward, rolling down a hill, and plunged into the river Seine. Within it were Patrick and Deirdre, along with their nurse. None survived. The river that had so often been her companion now became her executioner. In a moment, her joy was drowned. The grief was unbearable. Friends spoke of her as inconsolable, wandering in silence, her body heavy with sorrow. She who had always danced as though life itself moved through her, found herself now weighted by death. The press, ever eager for scandal, reported the tragedy with a mixture of pity and intrusion. Audiences whispered, some with sympathy, others with cruel judgment, but none could measure the depth of her loss. For Isadora, the river itself became a wound, a constant reminder that life could take as suddenly as it gave. Her art changed. Where once her movements flowed with the innocence of waves, now they carried the heaviness of grief. She danced not only for joy, but for mourning, each gesture a lament, each step an elegy. Audiences felt the difference. They said her dances now bore a haunting power, a rawness that pierced the heart. The loss of her children became part of her art, inseparable, inescapable. To watch her was to feel the depth of her sorrow, and yet also the persistence of her spirit. She continued to dance, not because she was healed, but because dance was the only language left to her. In her journal, she wrote of death and destiny, of the cruelty of fate, of the impossibility of consolation. She spoke of her children as though they were still with her, their presence lingering in her movements. When she lifted her arms, some said it was as though she were reaching for them, as though she were lifting them once more into her embrace. Her grief was never far from the stage, and audiences, even when they did not know the details, felt its shadow. Friends tried to comfort her, but what comfort could suffice? She had loved freely, defied convention, embraced scandal, but in the end she was no different from any mother who has lost her children. Her freedom could not shield her from grief. In her darker hours she drank heavily, seeking escape in wine and in fleeting encounters. Yet even in despair she remained radiant, her sorrow itself becoming part of the myth that surrounded her. The image of the river haunted her. The Seine, flowing quietly through Paris, became in her mind both a thief and a tomb. She would walk its banks again, but now with a gaze heavy and distant, as though searching for what could not be returned. The sound of water, once companion to her philosophy of flowing movement, now bore a weight of mourning. The river had become her adversary, yet also her mirror, for like her art, it held both beauty and destruction. This tragedy marked a turning point. She could not return to the innocence of earlier years. Her art would forever carry the shadow of loss, and her life would forever carry the ache of absence. Yet from this darkness arose new depths of expression. She danced with sorrow as partner, and audiences, whether in Paris, Berlin, or beyond, felt the raw truth in her movements. They wept as they watched her, for in her grief they recognized their own. This chapter closes with an image of the river at dusk, its surface dark and shimmering, the lamps reflecting upon it like broken stars. Isadora stands upon the bank, her tunic drawn tightly around her, her hair unbound, her face pale in the fading light. She does not move, but within her body the memory of her children stirs like a phantom rhythm, an ache that will never leave. The river flows on, indifferent, eternal, carrying both memory and forgetting. And from that river's silence arises the faint sound of children's laughter, imagined, remembered, lost, an echo that follows her as she steps into the next chapter of her restless journey. The faint sound of children's laughter lingers above the river, imagined, remembered, then lost, and when it fades, it leaves behind a silence so heavy that even the act of breathing feels like defiance. Out of that silence, Isadora turned to movement once more, for she could not bury herself with her children, nor could she remain still in a city that had become unbearable. The grief, though unending, began to drive her outward. If Paris had given her triumph and loss, then perhaps other lands might offer renewal, perhaps distance itself might soften the wound. So she traveled, her body still radiant, but her spirit carrying a fracture no ocean could mend. She moved restlessly across Europe, to Germany, to Greece, to Russia, always in search of a place where her vision could root itself more deeply. The applause of audiences mattered less now. What she sought was a future, a way to build something that would endure beyond her own fragile span. From the time she first began teaching children in San Francisco, she had dreamed of schools of dance, places where young bodies could grow free of constraint, guided by nature rather than rules. Now, after the loss of her own children, that dream returned with urgency, as though by building schools she might somehow restore what fate had taken. In Germany, she found sympathetic spirits, educators and artists who believed, as she did, that art must begin with freedom. With their support, she established schools where children danced barefoot in tunics, their laughter mingling with music, their movements echoing the rhythms of nature. She insisted that these children would be the future, not only of dance, but of humanity, embodying harmony between body and soul. To her students, she was more than a teacher. She was a visionary, sometimes stern, sometimes tender, always demanding that they move with sincerity. She told them not to mimic her, but to listen within themselves, to find the source of movement in their own breath, their own heartbeat. The schools were fragile, dependent on patrons, often threatened by lack of funds. Yet within their walls, for brief moments, Isadora's dream flickered into reality. Rows of children swaying like fields of wheat, their voices rising in song, their steps flowing without command. These images gave her solace, though never replacing the children she had lost. Some who watched her schools said they were less institutions than utopias, places where art and life blurred, where children seemed to live in another world altogether. Her travels also brought her to Greece, where she walked among ruins that had inspired her since youth. To dance in the shadow of the Parthenon, barefoot upon stones worn by centuries, was for her not performance but pilgrimage. She believed she was reviving the spirit of an ancient art, reconnecting modern life to origins long forgotten. She wore tunics modeled on ancient forms, posed among columns, let her body echo the stillness of statues and the flow of myth. To some, it was eccentric play. To her, it was sacred. In the ruins, she felt her children's presence, as though the timeless stones might hold them gently, beyond the reach of rivers. In Russia, too, she found both fascination and controversy. Her philosophy of freedom and movement resonated with some who dreamed of new societies, free of oppression, where art might serve as liberation. Yet others accused her of decadence, of bourgeois indulgence. She danced for audiences both adoring and hostile, her body once again a vessel of debate, as though each gesture carried not only beauty, but ideology. Still, she felt a strange kinship with Russia's vastness, its capacity for extremes, its passion that matched her own. It would not be the last time Russia drew her into its orbit. Everywhere she went, she carried the echo of her children. In her schools, she sought their memory in the faces of new students. In her dances, she sought them in gestures of reaching and lifting, in movements that seemed always to call for something absent. The grief became part of her art, inseparable from it, and audiences felt it even when they did not know its source. Her sorrow had deepened her, turning her from an innovator into a figure of tragedy. Her art not only liberation, but lament. She also grew more defiant in her personal choices. Love affairs continued, fleeting or stormy, each carrying both solace and sorrow. She spoke openly of her rejection of convention, of her belief that women must be free in love, as in art. Scandal followed her, as always, but by now scandal had become part of her aura, inseparable from the legend she was weaving. Some admired her as a prophet of freedom, others condemned her as reckless, but none could ignore her. In the quiet moments when she sat alone, perhaps in a German villa or in a Greek ruin at twilight, she must have wondered whether her schools, her travels, her loves could ever fill the void within her. Did she believe she could create a future large enough to silence the absence of her children? Or did she simply move forward because stillness would have been unbearable? The answers, like so much in her life, remain uncertain, drifting like questions whispered into wind. Her schools, though luminous in vision, struggled always with practicalities. Money was short, patrons unreliable, and her own restless spirit often drew her away when stability was most needed. Some students adored her, others feared her volatility. She was demanding, at times impatient, yet also capable of immense generosity. She wanted from her pupils not imitation but revelation, a quality few could sustain. Those who did became lifelong disciples, carrying her philosophy forward even when her own life wandered toward ruin. This chapter closes with an image of one such school, a great hall filled with sunlight, children in tunics moving in unison, their voices raised in song, their bodies swaying like branches stirred by wind. Isadora stands at the front, her face solemn yet radiant, her arms guiding them as though conducting an unseen orchestra. For a moment, it seems the tragedy of the river has been transformed into beauty, the absence filled by presence, the loss redeemed by creation. Yet when the music ceases and the children's voices fade, the hall echoes with emptiness, and the dream trembles like a fragile flame. The children run laughing into the gardens, their footsteps vanishing into distance, and Isadora is left standing alone, her tunic falling still, her arms slowly lowering, as though reaching once more for something that cannot return. The sound of children's footsteps fades into the garden, light and fleeting, leaving the hall empty once more, its air filled only with the ghost of song. That emptiness seemed to follow Isadora as she turned her gaze eastward to Russia, where the air itself was charged with anticipation, where the old world trembled and the new pressed against its boundaries. If in Greece she had sought the origins of art, in Russia she sought the promise of transformation, a land vast enough and passionate enough to carry her vision. Russia before the revolution was a country of contradictions, grand palaces gleaming with chandeliers, while peasants labored in fields, salons buzzing with poets and dreamers while police lurked in shadows, a people weary of chains yet uncertain how to break them. For Isadora, such extremes felt familiar, as though the land itself mirrored her own life of ecstasy and tragedy. When she arrived, she was welcomed with curiosity, for the Russians, lovers of both art and passion, sensed in her something both foreign and strangely kindred. She danced in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, her tunics flowing in candlelit halls, her bare feet tracing gestures unfamiliar to audiences trained on ballet's rigid symmetry. Some were scandalized, others were transfixed. The Russian spirit, with its taste for excess and intensity, recognized something of itself in her freedom. Critics wrote of her as a revelation, a prophetess of movement who embodied the soul rather than the technique of dance. Yet others dismissed her as eccentric, even dangerous, a foreigner stirring restlessness where discipline was already fragile. It was not only audiences she stirred. Poets, painters, and revolutionaries alike gathered around her. They saw in her art an allegory for the liberation they longed to achieve, the body breaking free of chains, the individual reclaiming nature, the soul asserting itself against oppression. Her philosophy of movement, born of grief and conviction, seemed to echo their political dreams. To them, her bare feet on stage were more than aesthetic. They were a declaration. Isadora, for her part, was captivated by Russia's fervor. She felt at home in its extremes, its capacity for passion, its refusal to be half-hearted. She believed, perhaps naively, that her schools of dance could play a role in shaping this new society. She dreamed of halls filled with children moving freely, of art becoming the foundation of a liberated people. She spoke of it openly, and for a time, her dream seemed to align with the tide of history. Yet not all welcomed her vision. To the guardians of tradition, her art seemed decadent, foreign, unsuited to the Russian spirit they wished to preserve. To some radicals, she seemed too bound to personal freedom, too unmoored from collective struggle. She occupied a precarious place, admired by many but distrusted by others. Still, she pressed forward as she always had, with conviction that art and life were inseparable. In the salons of Moscow, she met poets who recited verses of longing and despair, their words heavy with vodka and fire. She listened, her eyes alight, responding with her own philosophy of movement. Among them was Sergei Yesenin, a young poet whose verses burned with both tenderness and violence. Their paths would cross more fatefully in years to come, but already she sensed in Russia a destiny that would entwine itself with her own. For now, though, her focus remained on her art. She taught students in Russia, demanding from them the same sincerity she demanded everywhere. Some adored her, others found her impossible, for she would accept nothing less than authenticity. She could be mercurial, her moods shifting as swiftly as the Russian weather, but her vision never wavered. To her, each child she taught was a seed of a new humanity, each movement a gesture toward liberation. She performed in theaters filled with both aristocrats and workers, her dances bridging divides if only for an evening. The audiences wept, applauded, debated. Was she prophet or charlatan, genius or fraud? The uncertainty itself was proof of her power, for she left no one unmoved. She was a foreigner, yet in her freedom, the Russians glimpsed a reflection of their own restless longing. The revolution itself had not yet erupted, but the air vibrated with tension. Strikes, protests, whispers of uprising filled the streets. Isadora walked through them barefoot, her tunics flowing even in the chill. Some mocked her, others blessed her, and she herself felt she was walking in a land where history itself was a stage, where every gesture mattered. Perhaps she believed she was dancing not only for audiences, but for destiny. In the evenings, she sat with friends, glasses of wine clinking, smoke curling in the air, voices rising in argument and song. They spoke of art, of politics, of the future. She listened, sometimes silent, sometimes declaring that art must lead the way, that beauty was the foundation of any true revolution. They laughed, they argued, they admired her audacity. She belonged to none of their factions, yet somehow she belonged to all. And yet, beneath her fervor, the wound of her children remained. Russia, with all its promise, could not erase the ache of absence. At times, in the midst of laughter, her face would fall into silence, her eyes distant. Those who knew her best understood. The grief was always there, even when she danced, even when she laughed. Russia might offer her new loves, new dreams, but it could not restore what the Seine had taken. This chapter closes with the image of a theater in Moscow, its chandeliers dim, its wooden floor echoing with her bare feet. She stands at the center, arms lifted, her tunic flowing, her body moving as though it carries both the weight of sorrow and the hope of renewal. The audience is hushed, caught between disbelief and awe. Outside, the city hums with unrest, the red banners of revolution beginning to stir in the wind. And as her arms fall slowly, as silence once again wraps the hall, The faint flutter of those banners drifts inward, promising that her next steps will be taken not only in art, but in the tempest of history itself. The faint flutter of banners drifts inward from the streets, red against the gray sky, and in that restless air another figure steps into her life, a presence as luminous as it was perilous. Sergei Yesenin, the young Russian poet, entered her orbit not as a whisper, but as a storm. He was 20 years her junior, golden-haired, with eyes that seemed to carry both tenderness and violence. His verses spoke of fields and birches, of the Russian soil itself, but also of despair, of a soul forever on the edge of breaking. When he and Isadora met, it was as though two tempests collided, each carrying its own passion, each bound to disrupt the other's course. For Sergei, she was a goddess, a vision unlike any he had ever known. For Isadora, he was youth itself, wild and ungovernable, a flame she believed might warm her grief. Their union shocked those around them, not only for the difference in age, but for the intensity of their bond. They quarreled as often as they embraced, yet they were inseparable, drawn together by forces neither could resist. To the salons of Moscow they became legend, the barefoot dancer and the fiery poet, two figures of scandal and fascination entwined. Isadora saw in Yesenin a soul as restless as her own, and perhaps she believed she could save him, anchor him through her love as she could not anchor her lost children. She embraced him fiercely, defended him against critics, carried him into her world of art. He, in turn, followed her into hers, though often unwillingly, for his own demons, drink, jealousy, despair, rose against him. Their love was passion, but passion is never gentle. They married in 1922, though marriage had never been Isadora's creed. Perhaps she sought to protect him, to give him legitimacy in foreign lands, or perhaps she hoped that a vow might bind his unruly spirit. Whatever her reasons, the marriage became another source of scandal. Paris and New York buzzed with gossip. The great Isadora Duncan, wedded to a Russian poet half her age, a man as notorious for his drunken rages as for his verses. The press wrote of their quarrels, of hotel rooms destroyed in fury, of nights filled with shouting and reconciliation. They were a spectacle, their love as public as her dances, as chaotic as his poems. Together they traveled to the West. In Berlin, Paris, even New York, their presence was both celebrated and condemned. Audiences came to see her dance, but their eyes were equally drawn to the young poet by her side, whose blonde curls and blazing eyes made him a figure of fascination. Yet the Western world did not embrace him as Russia had. He spoke little English or French, grew restless in foreign cities, lashed out in drunken fits. Hotels bore the scars of his rage, friends withdrew from his chaos, and Isadora bore the burden of defending him, even as his violence turned against her. Their quarrels were legendary. He accused her of betrayal. She accused him of cruelty. They broke glasses, shouted in public, reconciled with tears. Those who witnessed them wondered whether they were bound by love or by destruction. Yet beneath the turmoil lay a tenderness undeniable. Moments when Sergei would rest his head upon her lap. His voice softened, his verses whispered like confessions. In such moments she held him as though he were both lover and child, fragile and fierce, beloved and unbearable. Her art during these years bore the imprint of their union. Audiences spoke of her dances as more tumultuous, more raw, infused with the chaos of her private life. She danced as though torn between ecstasy and despair, her body carrying both love's fire and love's wound. Some critics said she was declining, that scandal had consumed her. Others said she had never been more truthful, that in her very turbulence she revealed the essence of human passion. For Isadora, love was always inseparable from art, and in Sergei she found both inspiration and destruction. She wrote of him with reverence, even as he bruised her heart. She called him her beloved, her torment, her destiny. He, in turn, wrote verses filled with both adoration and rage, poems where tenderness dissolved into violence. Their marriage became not only a union but a performance, enacted across continents, witnessed by friends and strangers alike. Yet even Isadora's boundless faith could not save him. His drinking worsened, his violence grew more unpredictable, his despair deepened. In foreign lands he felt alien, suffocated, and though she tried to shelter him, her own restless spirit could not give him the stability he craved. Their marriage unraveled as swiftly as it had been forged, torn apart by storms too fierce to endure. By 1924, they were separated, their love unable to survive its own intensity. But Sergei remained bound to her in tragedy. Only months after their parting, he was found dead in a hotel room in Leningrad. His life ended by his own hand, a noose the final punctuation to verses of despair. He was only 30. The news reached Isadora like a blow she could not deflect. She had loved him, suffered with him, tried to save him, and now he was gone. Another loss carved into her already shattered heart. Her grief for Sergei was tangled, filled with both love and fury. She wept for him, but she also raged at him, at his violence, his destruction, his abandonment. She declared him a genius, a victim of a world that had not understood him. She carried his memory as she carried her children's, woven into the fabric of her being. For her, he became another ghost, another absence she would never escape. This chapter closes with the image of a hotel room in Paris, curtains drawn, glasses shattered on the floor. Isadora sits at the edge of the bed, her tunic fallen loosely, her eyes fixed on the shadows. Sergei's voice echoes faintly in her memory, verses of love and despair interwoven. Outside, the city hums indifferently, carriages rolling, voices laughing, life continuing. Inside, the silence is heavy, filled with both passion remembered and wounds unhealed. And from that silence emerges the faint sound of a door slamming, a departure that reverberates into her next steps, where love gives way once more to loneliness, and the stage becomes her only companion. The sound of the door slamming lingers in the air, sharp, abrupt, as if the echo itself were unwilling to fade. That door, once shut, marked more than a quarrel or a parting. It marked the unraveling of Sergei Yesenin, and with him, a chapter of Isadora's heart. For though their marriage had been storm, filled with wine and rage and embraces that broke into tears, the final silence that followed their separation was heavier than any noise they had made together. Sergei drifted back into Russia, into taverns thick with smoke, into nights that dissolved in drink. His poetry, once vibrant with fields and birches, grew darker, touched by despair. He was young, too young, and yet already weary of life, his verses heavy with the weight of inevitability. Friends saw the decline, but few could intervene. His nature, volatile and raw, resisted comfort as much as it craved it. He belonged to no one, not even to himself. And though Isadora was far away, she carried the ache of knowing. She had held him, defended him, tried to anchor him with her love, but she could not save him from the violence that dwelled within. News traveled slowly then, but when it reached her, it struck like lightning. Sergei was dead, found in a hotel in Leningrad in December of 1925, his life ended by his own hand. He was only 30, a poet silenced at the very edge of youth. To some, his death seemed inevitable, foretold in his verses. To others, it was a shock, the extinguishing of a fire too soon. To Isadora, it was both. She had seen the darkness in him, lived with it, felt it burn against her own spirit, and yet she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that love might turn him away from its abyss. Now the abyss had claimed him. Her grief for Sergei was unlike the grief for her children, yet no less consuming. Where their loss had been pure sorrow, his was tangled with fury. She wept for him, yes, but she also raged at him for his weakness, for his violence, for leaving her with nothing but ghosts. She called him her beloved, but also her tormentor. She spoke of him as genius, a soul too tender for the world, yet she did not deny the pain he had inflicted. Her mourning was not simple. It was a storm of contradictions, love and anger, tenderness and recrimination, all bound together in a knot she could never untie. She carried him into her art as she had carried her children. Her dances grew darker, filled with gestures that seemed to both embrace and reject, to reach and to push away. Audiences felt the turbulence, the restlessness of a woman who had lost not only her children but her lover, her partner, her enemy. They said she danced like a woman possessed, her movements at once tender and violent, as though her body itself bore the conflict of her heart. In public, she spoke of him often, defending his poetry, declaring him misunderstood, a victim of a world that had not cherished his genius. She recited his verses, sometimes in translation, sometimes in his own Russian, her voice heavy with grief. She made him part of her legend, just as he had made her part of his. Together they had scandalized the world, and now, even in death, their names remained entwined, two restless spirits joined by tragedy. Her friends worried for her, for she seemed increasingly fragile. Wine became her companion more than food, late nights more frequent than rest. She surrounded herself with students, with admirers, but she remained restless, unable to find the peace she had once dreamed of in her schools. She traveled still, performing in salons, sometimes in larger halls, but her reputation had begun to wane. Critics grew harsher, audiences more uncertain. Some said she was past her prime, that her dances no longer held the freshness of youth. Others, more sympathetic, said she had grown deeper, her art carrying wounds that made it unbearable in its truth. Isadora herself felt the shift. She knew time had altered her body, that her fame was no longer secure, that younger dancers had taken the stage. Yet she refused to surrender. She declared that dance was not about youth or beauty, but about truth. And truth, she insisted, did not fade. Still, behind her words lingered doubt, for she had always lived in extremes, and the thought of becoming ordinary, of being forgotten, filled her with dread. The memory of Sergei haunted her. She spoke to friends of his face, of his voice, of his last days. She imagined his despair, wondered if she could have saved him had she stayed. At times she idealized him. At times she condemned him, but she never escaped him. He became another absence to carry, another ghost to accompany her steps. Just as the Seine had stolen her children, Russia had taken her poet, and both rivers flowed now within her, currents of sorrow that shaped her every movement. This chapter does not end with performance or applause, but with the image of Isadora sitting alone in a dimly lit room, a glass of wine at her side. Sergei's verses open before her. The lamp flickers, casting her shadow against the wall, and in that shadow she seems both immense and fragile, a woman of legend reduced to solitude. She reads his words aloud, her voice trembling, as though by speaking them she might call him back. But the silence that follows is heavy, final, unbroken. Outside, the city continues, indifferent to her grief. Carriages pass, footsteps echo, voices rise and fall. Life moves on, as it always does. But within her room, time has paused, held captive by memory, by absence, by the echo of a poet who once burned too brightly. And as the lamp sputters, as shadows deepen, the faint sound of glass breaking drifts into the silence, a reminder of quarrels past, of nights when love and rage were indistinguishable. That sound carries forward into the next stage of her journey, where decline and persistence entwine, and the stage itself becomes both refuge and torment. The faint sound of glass breaking lingers, a sharp splinter in memory, and when its echo fades, it leaves behind another silence, the silence of stages that once welcomed her, now beginning to grow cold. Fame, like love, is mercurial, and just as swiftly as it embraces, it can withdraw. For Isadora, whose art had once been hailed as revelation, the years that followed Sergei's death brought a slow erosion, as though the world itself had grown impatient with her presence. Audiences who had once wept at the sight of her flowing tunics and barefoot steps now shifted uneasily, uncertain whether they were watching genius or decline. Critics, who in earlier years had compared her to muses and priestesses, now sharpened their pens with cruelty. They wrote that her movements had lost their freshness, that her body no longer carried the lightness of youth, that her improvisations had become indulgent, her philosophy repetitive. Some said she had become a parody of herself, a relic of a fading era. For a woman who had lived for the stage, who had believed her art eternal, these words were knives, yet she refused to surrender. Even as her bookings grew fewer, even as audiences dwindled, she continued to dance. Sometimes she performed in salons, in small gatherings where friends and disciples still revered her. Sometimes she appeared on larger stages, though the reception was often mixed, applause mingling with mutters. She danced not to please, but because she could not stop, because movement was as necessary to her as breath. To abandon dance would have been to abandon life itself. Her financial struggles grew heavier. Patrons who had once supported her turned their attention to younger talents. The schools she dreamed of founding remained fragile, often closing for lack of funds. She borrowed when she could, sold jewelry when she must, lived at times on the charity of friends. The extravagance that had once seemed romantic now appeared to many as recklessness, her inability to manage money a source of pity or scorn. Yet she herself seemed indifferent, as though wealth or poverty were only passing illusions, while art alone endured. Her students remained her most loyal companions. They revered her not only for her past triumphs, but for her philosophy, which continued to shape them. Some would carry her legacy forward long after her own fame waned. Yet even among them she could be difficult, demanding a devotion few could sustain, her mood swinging between generosity and severity. She wanted them to embody sincerity, to move not as copies but as vessels of truth. Some succeeded, others faltered, but all remembered her with awe, as though in her presence they had touched something larger than life. Isadora herself carried within her a growing sense of betrayal, not by her students but by time. She had believed that art rooted in truth could never fade, that audiences would always recognize sincerity. Now she discovered that the world preferred novelty, spectacle, the freshness of youth. She raged against it, declared that she would never bend, never compromise. She insisted that even if the world turned away, she would continue to dance, for the dance belonged to her body, not to their applause. Yet beneath her defiance, there was sorrow. To be forgotten, to be dismissed, was a wound as deep as any other she had suffered. The stages themselves seemed to mirror her decline. Dust gathered where once light had gleamed. Empty seats echoed with silence. She would step upon the wooden boards, her bare feet striking surfaces worn by countless performers, and feel both the memory of triumph and the weight of absence. To dance in such spaces was to converse with ghosts, the ghost of her younger self, the ghost of her children, the ghost of Sergei, the ghost of applause that no longer came as it once had. Her movements grew heavier, but also deeper. She danced not with the lightness of youth, but with the weight of experience, of sorrow, of survival. Some audiences did not understand, longing for the radiance she had once embodied. Others, more sensitive, felt in her decline a new power, a rawness that pierced more deeply than perfection could. They saw in her not only the mother of modern dance, but the embodiment of life itself, broken yet unyielding, scarred yet luminous. In these years, she turned more to writing, composing essays and reflections on her philosophy. She declared that dance was the mother of all arts, that it was the expression of the soul through the body. She wrote against schools and conventions, against the mechanization of movement. She defended her life, her loves, her choices, insisting that freedom was worth any price. These writings, though not widely read at the time, became part of her legacy, the words that carried her vision beyond the reach of her declining body. She still found patrons at times, still drew admirers who saw in her not decline but legend. Yet her circle narrowed, her resources diminished, her days often filled with uncertainty. She wandered between hotels, borrowed homes, and small apartments, never rooted, always restless. She sought solace in wine, in fleeting companionships, in the loyalty of her disciples. Yet even in these diminished years, she carried herself with a strange dignity, as though aware that legend does not vanish even when fame does. This chapter closes with the image of an empty theater, its seats dark, its stage dim. Isadora stands alone at the center, barefoot, her arms lifted not to an audience, but to silence. The dust swirls in the air around her, illuminated by a single shaft of light. She moves slowly, deliberately, her body heavy yet radiant, as though the emptiness itself were her partner. There is no applause, no critic, no witness but the silence. Yet still she dances, for to stop would be to die, and she is not yet ready to surrender. The dust settles, the silence deepens, and from that silence emerges the faint scratching of a pen against paper, a letter of desperation, a plea for funds, a confession of struggle. The stage fades and the sound of ink becomes the thread leading into her next chapter. The faint scratching of the pen carries forward, steady and desperate, a sound that is both the echo of thought and the confession of need. In these later years, when the theaters grew emptier and the critics harsher, Isadora often turned to letters, filling page after page with appeals, explanations, promises. Ink became another kind of stage, one where her words reached out in search of patrons, of friends, of anyone willing to believe in her vision. Each letter bore the same mixture of dignity and pleading, for though she never abandoned her defiance, she could not escape the truth. She needed money, and she needed it always. Her financial struggles were not new. Since her earliest days in London, she had lived precariously, borrowing, improvising, leaning on the generosity of others. But now the margin grew narrower, the debts heavier. She sold jewelry, pawned possessions, accepted gifts she could not repay. She moved between hotels and borrowed apartments, her life as transient as her art. Some pitied her, others scorned her recklessness, yet she herself seemed indifferent to the practicalities that consumed others. To her, money was an illusion, a tool that slipped through her fingers as quickly as sand, never to be clutched or hoarded. Art was real, money was not. Yet hunger, cold, and debt, collectors reminded her of its weight all too often. She continued to perform, but the venues were smaller now, often private salons or gatherings arranged by disciples. Sometimes she danced before only a handful, yet she gave herself fully, her body tracing arcs of sorrow and defiance across worn floors. She also continued to teach, guiding students with the same fervor as always, demanding sincerity, punishing imitation. To these young dancers, she was not a relic but a prophet, a woman whose presence still carried the force of revelation. They listened when she declared that dance was born in the solar plexus, that each movement must radiate from within. They wept when she reminded them that beauty was not ornament, but truth. Still, behind the lessons and the performances lay constant struggle. She wrote letters to wealthy acquaintances, promising to repay loans with performances, offering to dedicate schools to their names, pleading for enough to continue. Some responded with generosity, others turned away. She knew the indignity of dependence, yet she bore it, for she believed her mission worth any cost. She told herself that art demanded sacrifice, that her poverty was the price of her truth. Yet there were nights when the wine flowed heavily, when the loneliness pressed too tightly, and when even she must have wondered whether the sacrifices had been too great. Her writing during these years grew sharper, her philosophy crystallized by hardship. She declared that modern society was enslaved by materialism, that true liberation could come only through art. She spoke of dance as the soul made visible, as the foundation of all other forms. She denounced schools that crushed instinct, declared that children must be allowed to move as nature intended. These writings, though not widely read at the time, became seeds of her legacy, carried forward by those who recognized their power. Her disciples, the young women who trained under her, adored her with a devotion that bordered on worship. They lived simply, danced in tunics, followed her instructions with reverence. To them, she was not a woman struggling with debts, but a figure of destiny, a bridge between the ancient and the modern. They believed in her dream of schools filled with sunlight, even when the buildings crumbled and the funds vanished. For them, she remained the mother of modern dance, even if the world beyond dismissed her as a scandalous relic. Isadora herself carried within her a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability. She never doubted the truth of her vision, yet she could not escape the humiliations of dependence. She spoke boldly in public, yet in her letters she confessed need. She danced with dignity, yet in private she sometimes collapsed in despair. She was, as ever, a woman of contradictions, radiant and broken, proud and pleading, free and bound. The world around her was changing swiftly. Younger artists were emerging, new movements in dance and art capturing the attention of critics. The modern world, fascinated by machines and speed, seemed to have less patience for her philosophy of nature and antiquity. She felt the shift keenly, sensing that she was no longer at the center of innovation, but on its edges. Yet she refused to adapt. She declared that truth did not age, that her vision remained eternal. If the world turned away, it was the world that erred, not she. This defiance, both admirable and tragic, kept her moving even as her fame waned. This chapter closes with the image of her at a small wooden desk, hunched over paper, her hand moving swiftly, the ink smudging as she writes by the light of a flickering lamp. The room is modest, its walls bare, the air heavy with the smell of wine. The letter she writes is both proud and desperate, a plea for support, a promise of art yet to come. Her tunic, once radiant on stage, now hangs loosely around her shoulders, yet she writes as though addressing destiny itself. The scratching of the pen ceases, the ink drying on the page, and as she leans back, weary, the sound of rustling paper becomes the bridge to her next chapter, where words on a page give way to words in books, essays, and manifestos that carry her philosophy forward, even as her body falters. The rustle of paper lingers after the ink has dried, and soon it becomes the turning of pages, each leaf carrying not a plea, but a proclamation. For in these later years, when stages dwindled and money ebbed, Isadora poured herself into words. If her body could no longer speak to the world as it once had, then her philosophy would live in essays and reflections, in books that might outlast the fleeting breath of performance. She wrote not as a scholar, nor as one who sought careful argument, but as a prophetess, her sentences sweeping, fiery, insistent, carrying the rhythm of her own convictions. She declared that dance was the mother of all arts, that from the primal gesture of the body sprang poetry, music, sculpture, and painting. To her, the first human expression had been movement, the swaying of the body in rhythm with the earth, the lifting of arms in worship of the sun, the stamping of feet in echo of thunder. All other arts, she said, were children of this first language, imitations of what the body had once spoken directly. To restore dance to its rightful place was not merely an artistic act, but a return to origins, a reclamation of the soul's truth. Her writings repeated themes she had lived since childhood: the rejection of rigid schools, the necessity of freedom, the conviction that true movement must arise from within. She denounced ballet as artificial, a distortion of the body, a tyranny of form over essence. She called for dance to be natural, flowing, born of breath and solar plexus, radiating outward like waves from a stone dropped into water. She exalted Greece as the model, not as archaeology, but as eternal ideal, a world where body and spirit were one, where beauty was simplicity, where movement was worship. These manifestos were not always well received. Critics accused her of arrogance, of overstatement, of claiming too much. Yet those who read her with sympathy recognized in her words the same force they had once seen in her dancing, a refusal to compromise, a burning belief that art was more than entertainment, that it was revelation. Her disciples copied her writings, memorized her phrases, carried them forward as scripture. To them, she was not only a dancer, but a philosopher, one who spoke of life itself as movement, of the soul as rhythm. Her reflections were tinged also with autobiography. She wrote of her childhood by the Pacific, of her first steps toward freedom, of the grief that had marked her. She did not disguise her scandals, but embraced them as part of her truth. She wrote of love as necessity, of motherhood as both joy and wound, of tragedy as inseparable from creation. To read her words was to enter the storm of her life, to feel both its radiance and its ruin. She was never detached. She wrote as she lived, fully, passionately, without apology. Her essays also bore the mark of defiance against a world she believed had betrayed her. She denounced critics, scorned audiences who sought spectacle over sincerity, dismissed the modern fascination with machines and speed. She declared that art must resist such distractions, must remain rooted in eternal truths. These declarations isolated her further from the currents of her time, yet they also preserved her as a figure apart, untamed, unyielding. In quiet moments, she might have wondered whether her words would endure. Books could be ignored as easily as performances, and fame was fleeting. Yet she believed her vision larger than herself, and so she wrote with the conviction that someday, even if not now, the world would listen. Perhaps she imagined future generations of dancers, barefoot and free, turning her pages as scripture, carrying forward the philosophy that had been her life. Her disciples certainly believed it. They gathered her words, shared them, spoke of them with reverence. In studios, they repeated her phrases, reminding themselves that they were not merely learning steps, but embodying a philosophy. They saw themselves as heirs, as vessels carrying her flame into the future. For them, her writings were not abstract treatises, but instructions for living, guides to an art that was also a way of being. Still, behind the pages lay the same precarious life. Even as she wrote of eternal truths, she faced unpaid bills, unheated rooms, the gnaw of uncertainty. The contrast between her lofty declarations and her earthly struggles was stark, yet also fitting, for she had always lived in contradictions. She spoke of eternity while selling her jewelry, proclaimed freedom while writing letters of desperation. Perhaps it was this very contradiction that made her human, that kept her art from becoming mere abstraction. This chapter closes with the image of her at a desk, a pile of pages before her, her hand resting lightly upon them. The lamp glows dimly, casting long shadows across the room. Her tunic falls loosely, her hair unbound, her face weary, yet luminous. She lifts a page, reads aloud her own words, her voice steady, resonant. Dance is the soul made visible. The words linger in the air like a benediction, as though addressed not to the empty room, but to time itself. The page falls back upon the stack, the sound of paper against paper, soft but insistent, and in that sound we hear the rustle of turning not only of pages, but of years. For the words she has written will outlast the moment, but her body, restless as ever, seeks stillness nowhere. From the rustle of paper rises the hum of an automobile engine, distant at first, then nearer, carrying us into her next chapter, where speed and recklessness mingle with her restless spirit along the roads of the Mediterranean. The rustle of paper softens, and in its fading murmur, another sound emerges, the low hum of an automobile engine, steady, insistent as though the modern world itself presses upon her restless life. Isadora, who had always rejected the machinery of ballet and the rigidity of convention, found in the machine age both fascination and peril. Automobiles, with their speed and danger, drew her as strongly as they unsettled her. Perhaps she saw in them the same intensity she carried in herself, an energy that could thrill or destroy, depending on how it was steered. And so, in the years that followed her manifestos, she often rode in fast cars along the roads of the Mediterranean, the headlights cutting through the night as recklessly as her own spirit moved through life. She had settled for a time in Nice, on the southern coast of France, where the sea stretched endlessly and the light shimmered with a clarity unlike any other. It should have been a place of peace, a haven where her troubled heart might rest, but peace was never her companion. The Mediterranean sun was bright, but within her shadows lingered, and she filled her nights not with stillness, but with wine, with voices of companions, with the roar of engines. She remained restless, as though time itself were chasing her, as though stillness might allow sorrow to overtake her. Her companions in these years were often fleeting. Lovers came and went, friends gathered and dispersed, disciples clung to her with devotion but could not anchor her. She welcomed all with generosity, yet she seemed to belong to none. Those who rode with her in automobiles spoke of the exhilaration and terror, the wind rushing past, the curves of the coast blurring in speed. To her, it was another kind of dance, a choreography of wheels and road, of risk and freedom. Yet each ride carried with it the whisper of danger, a whisper she did not silence. Wine, too, became her constant companion. She drank deeply, sometimes to soften sorrow, sometimes to fuel conversation, sometimes simply because it was easier than refusing. In taverns and cafes, she was still radiant, her laughter filling rooms, her presence commanding attention. Yet beneath the laughter lay fatigue, the weight of years of loss and struggle. Friends watched her with both admiration and unease, sensing that she was walking always on the edge of an abyss, unwilling or unable to step back. Her art in these years was uneven, sometimes transcendent, sometimes chaotic. There were evenings when she seemed to summon once more the goddess-like presence of her youth, her movements flowing with a beauty that silenced audiences. But there were also evenings when she faltered, when her dances seemed more like fragments, gestures broken by exhaustion or distraction. Critics, already harsh, used these moments to declare her finished. Admirers insisted she still possessed a genius beyond comparison. The truth was both. She was no longer the Isadora of Parisian salons, nor the Isadora who had astonished Berlin or Moscow. Yet she was still herself, raw, honest, unwilling to feign what she did not feel. She spoke often of new beginnings, of opening another school, of creating one more sanctuary for children. Her disciples listened eagerly, but the plans rarely took root. Money failed, energy faltered, and her restlessness drew her onward before permanence could form. Yet she never ceased dreaming. Even as her own life narrowed, she imagined futures filled with light and movement, as though to dream were itself a form of defiance against the encroaching dusk. In Nice, she was both admired and pitied. The locals watched her with curiosity, recognizing the legend yet aware of her decline. She walked the promenades barefoot, her tunics fluttering in the sea wind, her hair loose, her presence unmistakable. Some whispered that she was mad, others that she was divine. She herself seemed indifferent to judgment, carrying her freedom as always, unbowed by scorn, unsoftened by pity. At night, when the automobiles roared along the coastal roads, she would lean back in the seat, her scarf trailing in the wind, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Did she sense the danger that clung to her? Did she welcome it or simply ignore it? Perhaps for her, danger was not something to be avoided, but something to be lived with, another form of intensity. For a woman who had lost so much, who had endured so many tragedies, the thought of risk may have seemed almost trivial, another rhythm in the dance of life. Her disciples remembered her in these years with both awe and confusion. She could be tender, embracing them as though they were her own children. She could also be volatile, scolding them fiercely, demanding perfection, then collapsing into laughter or tears. They saw in her not stability, but truth. A woman incapable of pretense, living each moment fully, whether in joy or despair. For them, these contradictions only deepened her legend. This chapter closes with the image of an automobile rushing along the Mediterranean road at night, its headlights piercing the darkness, its engine humming like a low, unceasing chord. In the passenger seat sits Isadora, her scarf fluttering wildly, her eyes fixed on the sea that glimmers faintly under moonlight. The road curves, the wind rushes, the night opens before her like a stage without end. And as the car disappears into the distance, the sound of its engine fading, another sound rises to take its place, the echo of footsteps in an empty studio, the memory of students moving under her gaze, their steps carrying both reverence and uncertainty. From the roar of the automobile, we return to the quiet rhythm of feet upon wooden floors, leading us into her next chapter, where her disciples recall her as saint and tormentor, muse and enigma. The roar of the automobile fades into the night, and in its absence another sound emerges, softer but no less insistent. The echo of bare feet upon wooden floors, the cadence of students moving under her gaze. For if the world beyond her often judged her with cruelty, within the walls of her studios she remained a figure of awe, remembered by those who trained with her as saint and tormentor, muse and enigma. To her disciples she was never ordinary. She was a force, a presence that demanded devotion, that consumed them even as it inspired them. The studios were not always grand. Sometimes they were spacious halls filled with light, windows open to gardens where children's laughter mingled with bird song. Sometimes they were borrowed rooms, bare and cold, with little more than a piano and a stretch of floor. Yet wherever she gathered her pupils, the atmosphere became charged, as though art itself had entered. She wore her tunics, moved barefoot among them, her gestures both imperious and tender. To some, she seemed a goddess descending among mortals. To others, she was a teacher whose demands could wound as sharply as they could elevate. Her method was unlike any other. She forbade imitation, insisting that each dancer must find movement within themselves. "Do not copy me," she would say, her voice firm, "for I do not wish to see myself repeated. I wish to see you." Yet paradoxically, her presence was so overwhelming that many could not help but echo her gestures. They longed to become her, to embody her radiance, even as she insisted they must embody themselves. This contradiction was both the difficulty and the gift of being her disciple. She demanded sincerity above all. A gesture without truth, a step without feeling, she condemned as false. She could stop a lesson abruptly, scolding a student for lifelessness, her eyes flashing with disappointment. At other times, she would praise with such generosity that the student felt lifted into eternity. Her moods were unpredictable, swinging from fury to tenderness in moments. Some wept under her criticism, others flourished under her praise, but none remained untouched. She shaped them not only as dancers, but as beings, demanding that they live with the same intensity she embodied. Her disciples often described her as both mother and tyrant. She could embrace them warmly, feeding them from her own table, speaking of them as her children, especially after the loss of her own. Yet she could also be merciless, her demands exhausting, her tempers frightening. They learned quickly that devotion to her was not easy, that to follow her was to surrender comfort, to accept contradictions, to live in the storm of her spirit. Yet they also knew that in her presence they touched something greater than themselves, something they could not find elsewhere. Some of her students would carry her legacy forward, founding schools, teaching her philosophy, preserving her dances. They remembered her not as a flawless instructor, but as a prophet, one whose words and gestures carried truths beyond technique. They recalled her saying that dance must come from the solar plexus, that it must radiate like breath, that it must be as natural as wind in trees. They spoke of her not only with reverence, but with awe, as though she were both human and myth. Even those who found her impossible could not forget her. They might leave in frustration, unable to bear her volatility, yet years later they would speak of her as the one who had awakened them to the power of movement. For to study under Isadora was never comfortable, but it was unforgettable. She left marks not only on bodies, but on souls. Her relationship with her disciples reflected her relationship with the world, generous yet demanding, inspiring yet destructive, filled with contradictions she never resolved. She could give everything and take everything, often in the same gesture, yet they followed her, for they knew that her vision was larger than her flaws, that through her they glimpsed a freedom few ever dared to imagine. She sometimes dreamed aloud of leaving her legacy in their hands, of schools that would outlive her, of generations of children dancing freely across the world. She called them the Isadorables, her chosen inheritors, the young women who would carry her philosophy forward. They adored her, but they also bore the burden of her contradictions, the impossibility of fully embodying her vision. For Isadora's art was inseparable from her own being, and to inherit it was to inherit both brilliance and sorrow. In their memories, the studios were filled not only with movement but with silence. After a lesson, when the students had left, the floor still carried the imprint of her bare feet. The air still held the vibration of her voice. Even in absence, her presence lingered, heavy, radiant, haunting. To remember her was to remember not only dances, but the very atmosphere she created, an intensity that could not be contained by walls. This chapter closes with the image of an empty studio at dusk. The windows are open, the last light of day slanting across the floorboards. Dust motes drift in the air, caught in the fading sun. The echo of footsteps still seems to vibrate, though the students have long since gone. At the far end of the room stands Isadora, alone, her tunic falling softly, her arms lowered. She looks across the empty space not with triumph, but with weariness, as though she knows that even disciples cannot fully carry her vision, that her art will always be bound to her own restless body. The silence of the studio deepens, and from it emerges another sound, the soft thud of bare feet upon a stage, heavier now, less certain, yet still defiant. From the echoes of students' memories, we pass into her own final performances, uneven, unpredictable, moments of both brilliance and collapse, the last gestures of a woman who would never surrender entirely to silence. The soft thud of bare feet upon wood rises from the silence of the empty studio, carrying us forward to her last performances, those evenings when Isadora still stepped onto the stage, no longer the radiant figure of youth, but still the embodiment of defiance. These performances were unlike the triumphs of Paris or Berlin, unlike the revelations of her early days when critics saw in her the rebirth of antiquity. Now they were uncertain, fragile, veering between brilliance and collapse, leaving audiences divided between awe and disappointment. Yet in their very unevenness, they revealed the truth of her life, that she was incapable of pretense, that she would give only what she had, whether it was luminous or broken. There were nights when she astonished still, when the years seemed to fall away and the goddess of movement returned, her tunic flowing, her arms lifting with a power that silenced the hall. Audiences wept, remembering the first time they had seen her, recognizing that her flame had not entirely dimmed. She could still summon the ocean within her, the wind, the ancient friezes come to life. In those moments, her legend was reborn, if only briefly, and even the harshest critics were forced into silence. But there were also nights when the wine weighed heavily, when her body faltered, when her movements lost coherence. Audiences muttered, critics sharpened their words, and friends wept quietly in the dark. They said she had become erratic, that she no longer commanded the stage but wandered through it. Some called her tragic, others absurd. Yet even in failure, she was compelling, for she never disguised herself, never tried to mask fatigue or sorrow with polished pretense. She gave what she had, and if it was broken truth. Her disciples, watching from the wings, defended her. They said that even in decline, she carried a power no one else possessed, that her authenticity mattered more than perfection. They spoke of her as a priestess who revealed the human soul in all its contradictions, whether exalted or exhausted. To them, her final performances were not decline but revelation, showing the world that art is not always beauty, but always truth. She herself seemed indifferent to criticism, at least outwardly. She declared that she had never danced for critics but for life itself, that audiences could take what they wished, but she would continue regardless. Yet those who knew her saw the wounds beneath her bravado. She longed still for recognition, for the embrace of the world, and its rejection pained her. She masked it with defiance, but the ache remained, another scar among many. The stages she appeared on were smaller now, less gilded, less filled with grandeur. Yet she carried into them the same conviction as when she danced before chandeliers and marble statues. Even in faded halls, even before half-empty seats, she danced as though destiny itself watched. She could not do otherwise. Movement was her breath, and as long as breath remained, she would dance. Sometimes she appeared in salons, intimate gatherings where friends and admirers welcomed her with reverence. In such settings, she seemed to glow again, her movements lighter, freer, her presence more luminous. Perhaps it was the intimacy, the absence of critics, the presence of loyalty that revived her. Those who saw her in such moments spoke of glimpsing once more the genius of her youth, unmediated, unbroken. Yet such evenings were rare, fleeting like the flame of a candle stirred by wind. Her performances in larger halls were often more chaotic. She improvised freely, abandoning structure, following impulses that bewildered audiences. Some said she had lost her art. Others said she was more truthful than ever. The truth, as always, lay in between. She was no longer the dancer of Greece reborn, but she was still Isadora, carrying within her every triumph and every tragedy, offering them to the world without disguise. These final performances carried an air of farewell, though she did not name it. Audiences sensed it, even when they could not articulate it. They felt they were watching not merely a performance, but the end of an era, the closing gestures of a woman who had given her life to movement. Some applauded with fervor, others shook their heads, but all knew they had witnessed something irreducible. Isadora herself spoke often of death in these years, not with fear but with familiarity. She declared that she was ready whenever it came, that her life had been full, that she had danced as she wished. Yet, even as she spoke of readiness, she continued to plan, to dream of new schools, of new works, of new beginnings. She lived always between endings and beginnings, never surrendering fully to either. This chapter closes with the image of a dim theater, its seats half filled, its air heavy with expectation. Isadora steps barefoot onto the stage, her tunic simple, her hair unbound. She begins to move, slowly, heavily, yet with a gravity that draws the room into silence. Her arms lift, her body sways, her breath flows. For a moment, time itself seems to pause, uncertain whether it is watching brilliance or ruin. The audience waits, holding its breath, and as her movements fade into stillness, the silence that follows is thick, unresolved, neither triumph nor failure, but something between. Into that silence slips the faint rustle of fabric, the whisper of silk against air, a sound that will carry us toward the final chapters of her life, where even clothing itself will become an instrument of fate. The faint rustle of silk drifts across the stage, at first no more than the whisper of fabric against skin, yet in its sound lies an omen, a foreshadowing of what would come. For in those final days in Nice, Isadora wrapped herself often in long scarves, flowing and bright, as though they were not garments but companions, extensions of the very movement she had always sought. They trailed behind her in the Mediterranean breeze, fluttering like banners of defiance, like remnants of the tunics she had worn since the salons of Paris. And yet in their beauty lurked the thread of fate. In Nice, she lived with little comfort. Her rooms modest, her resources meager, her fame largely faded. Yet still she spoke of new beginnings. She told friends she would open another school, perhaps here, perhaps in Italy, perhaps somewhere still unseen. She spoke of writing again, of creating new works, of embarking on travels that might restore her name. To some, these plans seemed delusions, the dreams of a woman unable to face decline. To others, they were proof of her indomitable spirit, her refusal to surrender even as the world turned away. For Isadora was never still, never resigned. She dreamed as she had danced, without compromise even when reality could not follow. She entertained companions in these final days, lovers and friends, disciples who remained loyal despite the hardships. She laughed often, drank deeply, filled the air with stories. Those who saw her then remembered her not as broken, but as radiant still. Her eyes alive, her presence magnetic. She was volatile, yes, quick to anger, quick to tears, yet always she carried the aura of legend. Even in decline, she was unforgettable. The streets of Nice watched her barefoot figure pass, her scarves trailing, her hair loose, her stride as free as ever. Some shook their heads, whispering of scandal. Others smiled at the sight, recognizing the spirit that refused to bow. The Mediterranean itself seemed to reflect her contradictions. By day, the sea shone with calm brilliance, waves glittering under sunlight. By night, it grew restless, its depths concealing silence and danger. Isadora walked often by its edge, her footsteps leaving faint impressions in the sand. Perhaps she saw in its endless rhythm a mirror of her own life, surges of brilliance followed by retreats into shadow, never still, never final. The sea had always been her first teacher, from the Pacific tides of San Francisco to the Seine that had stolen her children. Now, in the last days, it remained her companion, whispering of both beauty and loss. She continued to perform occasionally, though these were not the grand stages of her past, but small gatherings, private salons, evenings among friends. In such moments, she would dance a fragment, a gesture, a movement that reminded all present of who she was. Sometimes she astonished still, her arms flowing with grace, her steps echoing the ocean's rhythm. Sometimes her movements faltered, weighted by fatigue, yet always she gave herself fully, for she knew no other way. Even in fragments, her art remained her truth. Those close to her remembered her speaking with unusual hope in these days. She bought new garments, including a red silk scarf, long and flowing, vibrant as flame. She told companions she felt new beginnings stirring, that her life was not yet finished. She dreamed aloud of another love, another school, another rebirth. Perhaps she believed it, or perhaps she simply refused to believe otherwise. Hope had always been her companion, as necessary as defiance. She could not live without it. And yet, beneath her words, fate moved silently. The scarf trailed longer, the nights grew wilder, the roads of Nice carried their own dangers. Friends worried, but did not intervene. She had always lived recklessly, always courted extremes, always carried tragedy as shadow. To stop her was impossible. To love her was to accept the inevitability of both brilliance and ruin. This chapter closes with the image of her standing upon the promenade in Nice, the sea behind her, the evening wind lifting her scarf. The fabric flutters outward, glowing red in the fading sun, as though a flame against the horizon. Her eyes are bright, her mouth curved in a smile half of promise, half of defiance. She speaks of tomorrow, of new plans, of life yet to come. Around her, friends listen, some believing, some doubtful, but all unable to turn away. The scarf trails longer in the breeze, its end brushing against the ground, and in its whisper lies the beginning of the final act. The sea murmurs faintly, the automobiles hum in the distance, and from the trailing silk emerges the sound of an engine turning, a car waiting, a ride that will carry her from hope into legend. The scarf trails longer in the breeze, its red fabric flickering like flame against the darkening sky, and from its whisper the hum of an engine rises. An automobile waits, polished and restless, its open seats beckoning. Isadora steps toward it with the same recklessness she had carried all her life, her tunic flowing, her eyes alight with promise. She has spoken of new beginnings, of schools yet to be founded, of love yet to be discovered. She believes, or chooses to believe, that tomorrow still holds possibility. And so she climbs into the car, wrapping the long scarf around her neck, letting its ends flutter behind her like banners of defiance. The engine growls, the wheels turn, and the car surges forward into the Mediterranean night. The scarf lifts in the wind, arcs of red against darkness. But within moments, its trailing length finds the spokes of the wheel, wraps tightly, pulls suddenly. In an instant, her head is wrenched backward, her body thrown, her breath silenced. The car does not slow, the night does not pause, the world does not soften. Fate, long delayed but never absent, strikes with brutal swiftness. It is September 14th, 1927. She is 50 years old. The news spreads quickly across Nice, across France, across Europe. The woman who had danced barefoot beneath chandeliers, who had defied ballet and convention, who had lost children and lovers and still carried herself with defiance, has died in an accident so bizarre it seems almost staged by destiny. The scarf, symbol of her freedom, has become her executioner. The automobile, emblem of the modern age, has claimed her life. The world is stunned, horrified, fascinated. Some speak of tragedy, others of irony, others of inevitability. For many, her death seems too fitting, too dramatic, too entwined with her legend to be mere accident. Her disciples weep. Her friends gather in sorrow. The newspapers, always hungry for scandal, print lurid headlines, some respectful, others cruel. Her enemies declare her end a metaphor for her life, reckless, excessive, doomed. Her admirers declare her immortal, her art eternal, her death merely another gesture in the dance of destiny. She herself is silent at last, her body stilled, her voice no longer rising in defiance. Yet in that silence her presence lingers, carried in memory, in movement, in words. What remains of her? Not wealth? Not security? Not comfort? What remains are fragments. Disciples who carry her teachings, essays filled with her philosophy, memories of performances that changed the way the world understood dance. She is remembered as the mother of modern dance, the woman who freed movement from the cage of ballet, who returned it to nature, who declared the body itself a sacred instrument. Her life, filled with scandal, tragedy, and defiance, becomes legend, her name whispered not only in studios, but in history. Yet questions remain, as they always do with figures larger than life. Was she genius or eccentric? Prophetess or self-destroyer? Was her art revelation or indulgence? Was her life a triumph or a ruin? The answers shift depending on who speaks, for she was never one thing alone. She was contradictions embodied, light and shadow, ecstasy and despair, freedom and bondage, creation and destruction. Perhaps that is why she endures, because she cannot be reduced to certainty, because she continues to unsettle as much as she inspires. Her disciples carry her dances forward, adapting, preserving, transforming. Generations of dancers trace their art back to her, whether they know it or not, for she changed the course of movement itself. Ballet would continue, but beside it would grow modern dance, free, expressive, rooted in the very philosophy she had lived. In each barefoot step upon a stage, in each gesture drawn from breath rather than command, Isadora lives again. Her story closes, but her presence does not fade. Even now, one can imagine her walking barefoot along the shore, her scarf trailing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The waves rise and fall, indifferent yet eternal, carrying echoes of her earliest lessons. She lifts her arms, sways with the rhythm of the sea, and for a moment she seems both child and goddess, mortal and immortal, broken and whole. The tide withdraws, leaving only footprints in the sand, but already the next wave approaches, erasing and renewing, as though reminding us that nothing is ever final. This chapter ends with the image of the sea under moonlight, the waves endless, their rhythm unbroken. The scarf lies still now, silent, its fabric no longer fluttering, but remembered as flame against night. And in the sound of the waves, we hear the echo of her life, brilliant, sorrowful, defiant, unfinished. For though her body is gone, her art remains, her legend continues, her dance moves still in the memory of the world. The waves rise, they fall, they return, and so too does her story, never ending, always beginning again.